Welcome, and if you are new here, this is going to be a little bit of a different video compared to what I normally do, but it's an important topic to cover, so I recommend you watching it all the way through. And if you aren't new here, then welcome back, and I'm going to be doing, like I just said, a bit of a different video, and I believe it'll provide a lot of value to people, so I'm going to go straight into it. And this question of why crime rate is increasing. First, you have to understand that crime rate is increasing. There's a study from Brookings.edu which states that the share of violent crimes that are homicides increased significantly in all four cohort cities between 2019 and 2022. 44% in Philadelphia, 33% in Chicago, 11% in Seattle, and 9% in New York City. So, to start off, crime is happening, and that has been shown as undeniable evidence. So, with that being said, why is it increasing? And I have a few things here that I'm going to mention, and they all craft together to create this big, ubiquitous reasoning behind why crime is increasing. So, to start off, lenience on laws. And the way I mean lenience is that they have not rather the laws themselves been lenient, but the application or the creation of laws have been very lenient. You've been allowed to edit many laws very easily. You've been allowed to scrape around in certain ways to try to manipulate other people or manipulate the law in a way where they can't actually apply to you because it doesn't fall into like that elastic clause, which if you didn't learn history or you just don't know what that is, elastic clause is basically the ability for people in government to apply the law to a certain extent. And basically what we've learned from recent people getting criminalized over certain things is that the elastic clause can really stretch to any imagination. It's pretty bullshit because the interesting thing about this elastic clause is that it really opens up for any sort of manipulation when it's actually used, right? Now, most people don't use it because most people aren't 3% of the psychopaths. However, when the 3% does arrive, you get people who are manipulative and try to apply the law in a way where it benefits them, but it revokes and takes from others. And that's a really big problem when you get the elastic clause because they can bend the law into the way where it affects you and not to where it affects somebody else. So crime rate's increasing because, bringing this to make actual sense here, is that they're able to do these crimes that just avoid this elastic clause where they're applying power in other places because they're basically distracted, essentially. The government is distracted, and the criminals are able to do what they want. That's a simple number one. Number two, freeing of criminals in cities. Now, this is highly politicized, and it's really just kind of wishy-washy bullshit. I mean, most of this is. But when you see that crime rates are increasing in the cities, like we just mentioned, and you also see cases where where like certain criminals are able to free themselves, not like break out, but just basically essentially give themselves freedom and run back into the streets of the cities without any real consequence or not even serving their time, you really get a lot of problems. And also, to emphasize on this, the prison system itself is horrible in America because it has zero accountability for the psychological damage that could be done to criminals. But the solution isn't to just release them because that makes no sense, right? If you're going to release a psychologically damaged criminal, what do you think they're going to do? So, think upon that. It shows you that this ideology of the freeing of the criminal to keep people safer from the criminal that's being freed later from psychological warfare is something entirely altruistic and fake because, well, look at the numbers, right? And now, here's another one that will contribute to why crime rate is increasing. Drug cartels' profitability rates and appeal for poor communities. Here's what I mean. You have the economic hierarchy, right? Obviously, poor people, rich people. When drug cartels come in and they're able to deliver drugs to citizens of any country, perhaps, you really often strike the poor people because the poor people have a usually higher sense of suffering or acute awareness to suffering, and they will try to get rid of that rather than try to use that as a reason to get out of that poor status situation, right? And with that being said, drugs are very appealing and they can be bought pretty easily, and especially in poor communities because, well, they don't have funding for police officers, and even if they do have funding for the officers, are the officers going to end up, are the officers also in the same situation as the citizens of that city are? And that's where you commonly get that Hollywood Western, oh, I'm a police officer, but I'm really working for the criminals, and blah, 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 blah. You get the whole, that's where that kind of thing comes from. So what we're seeing now is the actualization of this by seeing the drug cartels selling drugs to poor citizens in poor cities where they can either sell it again and profit for a lot of money, or they'll buy it, take it, and have less suffering for a shorter period of time, but then end up getting absolutely addicted to whatever drug that is. Or if they're in the really special case, not as special, but if they're in the 2023 case, it's just fentanyl and you die. So, why crime rate is increasing? That's a big contributor. And another one is I'll call it the discouragement of officers. Just to be nice. Discouragement of officers doing their jobs as a sort of social reform that people feel is necessary to make applying the law better. Now, sorry, but police brutality is often the words that come up when mentioning something like this, or BLM, or other movements of that nature, right? Okay, so if these people in these movements, or these people in general, are doing crimes, but the officers are socially discouraged to be officers because they're being claimed as brutal totalitarians, well, that means that they're obviously not going to want to protect the people because when they're protecting the people, they are getting damaged for doing that. It's a simple human rule, right? You avoid pain and try to go for pleasure, usually. If the pleasure's good or not, that's a different story. But humans in nature avoid pain, go to pleasure. So, if they're saving people, they get pain, they're going to go away from that. They're not going to save people. People are going to die. Crime rate's going to increase. It all comes together. And you really start to see the puzzle when you look at it from an external perspective. And it's a very easy one to solve, but the problem is that we're so politically divided and we look like a bunch of fucking idiots that we can't actually think about trying to say, okay, your idea is stupid, your idea is also stupid, yours is smart, yours I might take account in, they're left, they're right, I don't give a shit, put the ideas together and actually execute a good idea, right? Because the problem is that everyone's trying to execute their own ideas, and it's basically just a fucking government battlefield, right? I'm watching the fucking missile hit the warship on the Republican side, and I'm watching the fucking threes shoot back to the Democrats. It's what am I watching here? Like, I'm literally watching the self-sabotage and dissolvement of my country's constitution and governmental laws because everyone's too fucking stupid to say, okay, this is too much, calm the fuck down, solve the problem. And it's going to be really interesting for my generation, especially, because in the next, 30, 40 years, I think it's going to be a hell show, because we're going to really see the long-term effects of, let's say, putting pesticides in the ground to grow food, to genetically modify things, to get people hooked on the things that have certain ingredients which are carcinogens, to have cigarettes, e-cigarettes, porn. We're going to be, my generation is going to be really the first generation that has been addicted to all this dog shit and is just going down this pile of destruction. And hence, more crimes are going to happen because they're going to be mentally damaged. My next point, mental health crisis. Outside of just in terms of crime, the mental health crisis is loneliness, depression, anxiety, lack of social communication. The list really goes on, but I am not capable of really going into detail on that because I am not knowledgeable enough. But to go off these basic ones here, they cause people to do more crimes because their mental health is unstable, and usually what that means is that their cognitive functioning isn't as high as a normal person's would be. So when they go out into the real world and they see something and they see it in a different light or a different perspective that really shouldn't be seen in such a way, it often causes unnecessary violence or other things like that. And that's you. And I think I basically just defined insane people because they just view the right thing as a different thing. They don't. An interesting thing to note here is that criminals don't actually think they're doing it wrong most of the time. And the ones that do, they usually admit it, and they're usually fucking way long in prison already, right? So, to keep that in mind, criminals think that they're actually doing the right thing, okay? And that's because, like I said earlier, people move to pleasure and avoid pain. And if they believe that a higher justice than the law itself would be to do a certain thing that probably breaks the law, then they're going to go towards that thing. However, how they came up to that conclusion is a different story. That's more psychological, which is outside of my realm, and I can't really help that person because I'm not a fucking psychiatrist. But, going off of that, now that we understand how the mental health crisis can actually lead to crime rate increasing, I want to bring up one last point on why crime rate itself is, well, can you guess? It's increasing. Gotcha. But anyways, last point, legalization of drugs to an extent. Now, if you're in the United States, you know marijuana has been legalized in numerous cities, right? And numerous states, sorry. And now, some could say it's not bad, some could say it's not good. There's obviously many different battles here. I will stake my ground in it's good for medical reasons. However, I just saw this on the news yesterday that that New York was banning illicit cannabis stores, right? Because what do you expect is going to happen when you try to legalize a drug that people use to get high? It's like, okay. So, keeping that in mind, basically, what's happening is these people are getting high, which is not legalized, by the way. These people are getting high, and let's say they did marijuana, and let's say that the effects of it, for instance, we'll say the effects are that you're they become a lot more lax, and you aren't really sure of like what exactly you're doing, but you're kind of just like doing it for fun, right? And now if we mix that with a criminal who is, or with someone with the criminal or psychopathic ideology, and they're relaxing and they're going towards the pleasurable things for them, now you get people that are much more inclined to do a crime because they are high. So the legalization of drugs is going to help with that, because they can literally just walk to a store 2 blocks down, grab, I don't know, like 5 ounces of weed, come home, smoke that shit, and then there you go. And then even if, right, they get a medical license for marijuana, there is a very high likelihood that the person who gets that is probably going to try to smoke it. Unless it's obviously like, well, you can't smoke CBD oil, right? Obviously, like something like that is different. But if you're getting literal weed, like, obviously it's going to be pretty easy to smoke. And then, let alone the fact that if you're legalizing a weed store, that means that someone has to be growing weed, right? Which alone is a different crime. But obviously not the type of crime that we're really interested in, but that brings up another point too. So, to end out this video, crime rate is increasing, and why it's increasing is due to a numerous amount of factors, including lenience on laws, freeing of criminals in cities, drug cartels' profitability rates and appeal for poor communities, discouragement of officers, the mental health crisis, and legalization of drugs to an extent. And I hope that this video has enlightened you on why crime rates are increasing. I want to try to provide the best value I can towards this, and it's not exactly the best subject to talk about, and it's not exactly, let's say it's not exactly PC, for instance, but it's important for this message to get across because the value behind it is much more important than someone else's ideologies, right? Would you rather have someone telling you that murder isn't going on, or would you look outside and see someone getting stabbed on the street and say there's a lot of murder going on? Right? So it's that separation that needs to be made in this society. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of mind-controlled people who believe anything that is put in front of them, or just people that don't have an individual mentality to think and resolve something with their own mental willpower. And as always, we're here to help you help them.